So it's 11 o'clock in the morning now on Saturday. And I want to welcome you to the first of our online quilt documentation days. I'm pleased that those of you who are here. And I wanted to start out by just saying that this is supposed to be a conversation. And so if you wouldn't mind, anytime you have a comment or a question, if you could please type into the sidebar a message for me. When I have finished my introductory comments, I will look at your comments. I will share what you share with us about who you are and what your relationship to quilts are, and any questions or comments you might have. So please, as I'm talking, take the time to go ahead and type in any comments, thoughts, introductions of yourself and your quilts and your interest in quilts. So I am Jane Prysby. I am fortunate to be the director of the McKissick Museum at the University of South Carolina. And a little bit about me and my relationship to quilts and textiles. I grew up, my grandfather on my mother's side of the family was a textile mill worker. He worked at the West Point Pepperell plant in West Point, Georgia. And so while, our family didn't necessarily have, or his family, our family didn't necessarily have the finer things in life, we always had wonderful sheets and towels because of the discount my grandfather got at the mill store. So I grew up thinking that, knowing that cotton textile production was an important economic sort of thing. It was a big part of my grandfather's and my mother's family's life. They lived in sort of a mill town or outside of that. And then on my father's side of the family, my grandmother and grandfather from Poland immigrated in 1929, which was not a great year to be coming to the United States. But thank goodness my grandmother had trained as a professional seamstress in Poland. So the way she supported her family once she got here was by making wedding gowns and other, gowns for more affluent families in Pittsburgh. She lived in a small town, steel mill town outside of Pittsburgh. So I grew up, when we would visit them, I would sleep in the sewing room. There was a cot there in the sewing room. And so again, I grew up having a great respect for and understanding of the importance of sewing as a skill and of textiles as certainly an economic driver, but just appreciating having nice things, textiles around me. So that's me. So we're here today because I wanted to sort of just, give you some background on why the museum started these quilt documentation days in the first place. So we were hosting an exhibition curated by our chief curator of folklife and fieldwork, Sadler Taylor, called Piece by Piece, Quilts from the Permanent Collection, because McKissick Museum has a substantial quilt collection. And we decided to start hosting quilt documentation days the second Saturday of the month in the spring in order to really kickstart and reignite a really important research project that McKissick had pioneered back in the 1980s under the leadership of folklorist Laurel Horton, who lives in Seneca, South Carolina. So she was a young folklorist, and she and the McKissick staff undertook what became the second statewide quilt history project in the United States. At that time, Kentucky was the only state to have undertaken a systematic look at and survey of quilts in their state. And so we were really at the forefront of that. And very soon, the data that was collected from that first documentation project will be on the Quilt Index. It's not on there yet, but the digitization project process took some time and energy, as you might imagine. And now the documentation that was done in the 1980s under Laurel Horton's leadership will be available as part of an international really research database for people like me who are interested in quilt scholarship. Again, at that time in the 80s, quilts had not really been taken up as an object of serious academic study, either in our history or at that point, American studies I don't think it existed yet as a field. But the women's movement had really had sparked an interest, especially among women, in looking at the history of quilts as part of the history of women's art that hadn't quite been, documented yet and studied seriously. So McKissick was at the forefront of that, and we are continuing that now with your help and collaboration, because without you sharing with us what quilts you have from your family or have collected from flea markets or wherever, however you have acquired the quilts that you might have at your home and that you value. Without that, we can't do our job as researchers. So this program, Quilt Documentation Days, are to invite you to collaborate with us in this ongoing research project. So how exactly are we going to do this online? When we were doing it in person in February, we had a process for doing that. Well, we've developed a process that I hope will be easy to follow for doing this online. And a lot of the work will happen between you and me offline. So what we've done is prepared a quilt documentation form, and you can access that on the museum's website. And I have typed that into one of the fields here on the Facebook page, so you can easily access that. So what I'd like you to do is share that, fill that out to the best of your ability, and share that with me, along with a minimum of 6 photographs of each of the quilts that you would like to have a conversation about. Okay, so the 6 images that I need, one is a full image of the quilt. To your best, the best of your ability, we need a picture sort of like this of the whole quilt. And you can do that by either putting it on a bed, putting it on a sofa, a big table. I just need to see the whole thing, because what you can see with the whole thing is the large graphic design elements of the piece. In the case of this particular quilt, but really, it's a 16 patch quilt, not a very unusual or difficult pattern. It was used very much to use up scraps. So it's a really scrappy quilt. But one of the clues to dating it and understanding who made it is all the pink. There's a double pink fabric that the quilter used to sash all the 16 blocks. And that's a real clue that that this quilt was made probably in the last quarter of the 20th century, or 19th century rather. So 1875 to 1900 was sort of the heyday of double pinks, even though they were available and being printed, throughout a large part of the 19th century. But for some reason, there at the end of the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, many quilters were using double pinks in their quilts. It was very color fast, so that might have been a reason they used it. It also went very nicely with a lot of the shirting fabrics that women had access to scraps of and from. So this particular piece behind me is incorporating a lot of those kind of shirting fabrics, striped fabrics in browns and some blues. So I need a picture of the whole quilt top, if you can get that for me. And then I want you to just flip that over, and I need a picture of the whole back, because sometimes the backing of the quilt will have different fabrics on it. It will have feed sacks on it sometimes with words printed that are often a real clue to where it was made, or the resources to which the quilt artist had access. So it's important to have a picture of the whole back of the quilt, just so we can kind of see what that looks like. And then the third image that I would need from you is a quarter of the quilt. So I've already folded this one behind me. So I need you to fold it in half and then fold it in quarters so that it's like this, so that I can get some idea. By getting a picture of a quarter of the quilt, I can begin to look a little more closely at the design units. Sometimes with a quarter of the quilt, I can begin to see the quilting pattern even, although sometimes if you take a picture of the whole back of the quilt, sometimes if the quilting pattern is really pronounced, I can see that there. But on a quarter of the quilt, I can see a lot of things that I can't see in the whole quilt, like behind me. So I can start seeing, if the one behind me were in quarters, you could begin to see that this might have been a collaboration, because some of the blocks that incorporate striped fabrics are very meticulously organized so that the stripes are all in the same direction. And then some of the blocks are not so meticulously sort of designed. So it looks like it might have been a collaboration between at least 2 people who were making blocks and sharing them and putting them in a quilt, in a scrappy utilitarian quilt. So I need it folded into a quarter, a picture of the quarter of the quilt, and then folded again the other side so I can get an image of the back of the quilt, a quarter of the back of the quilt, because again, I can begin to see what the quilting pattern might have been, whether it's outline quilting or just a general clamshell pattern quilting. It will show me quite a bit. So the fifth image I would need from you to have a really meaningful conversation about your quilt is an image of the edge of the quilt that shows the binding really clearly. So this quilt, has a binding that is separate from the top. So it's not the top rolled over to the back. It's actually stitched on the top. And then on the back, similarly, it is not a binding that was created from the back rolled over to the top. So what does that say to me? Well, it tells me a little bit about the professionalism or the experience of the needleworker, because people who were making quilts, had experience as seamstresses, they would have taken the time probably to create this kind of binding because it lasts longer oftentimes, but more importantly, if you're making a quilt that's going to, you're going to intend to use repeatedly for a long time, the binding will wear out. And if you have a separate binding, you can easily replace it. You're not messing with the integrity of either the top or the back. If you have a separate binding, you can just replace the binding. Whereas if you have rolled over the back to the top or rolled over the top to the back to create a binding, it's a little bit harder, messier. It starts messing with the integrity of the top or the bottom of the quilt. So I need a picture of the edge of the front of the quilt, and I need a picture of the edge of the back so I can tell how it's been bound. So that's what I need from you. And once I get that, I will call or email you to set up a time that we can have a conversation so that we can sort of construct the story that we think this quilt has the capacity to tell based on what you know about it, and then based on what I can tell about it from what I can see in the images. And there may be some questions. Again, you'll be able to see it, up front and personal in a way that I can't, and I can ask you questions on the phone about what you're seeing, and we can clarify again just what kind of story that this quilt can tell. And so once we do that, the next quilt documentation day, which will be on Saturday, May 9th, I will start to share what the stories are that you and I collaborate to construct about the quilts that are in our community. So let me take a minute now to see if anybody has questions. I see Jugnu's here. Jugnu, good to see you. Welcome. Does anybody have any questions? I'm getting a text. Again, take your time if you have any comments or questions or want to introduce yourself to our Facebook Live video program. Please do. Well, so far, I don't see any comments or questions coming in. But let me reiterate that if you want to participate in our quilt documentation days, please go to the McKissick Museum website and download the form. And on the form, it has my email address so that you can send that to me. I'm getting text from my supportive Folk Life program coordinator, Ian Halligan. Shout out to him for helping me set this all up. So I think I have, invited you to look more on the Facebook page for information about how to participate moving forward. And in closing, I am unfortunately going to make a shameless promotion for you all to participate in Midlands Gives this year. For the first time, McKissick Museum will be participating in the crowdfunding giving day that the Central Carolina Community Foundation has been sponsoring for a number of years now. So many of you may already know about Midlands Gives from other organizations here in the Midlands. Midlands Gives is really to sort of raise the profile of the work, the important work that many nonprofit organizations in the Midlands do throughout the year. And this year's Midlands Gives is on May 5th, Cinco de Mayo. And we are inviting the McKissick Museum friends to make a gift, if possible, between 10 a.m. and 10:59 a.m. so that our museum is eligible for certain prizes. That's our power hour that we're trying to encourage people to give. And I know that this is a really tough time to be asking anyone to give to something like a museum cause. And I just want to assure everybody that, we set a goal of raising $5,000, months ago before the coronavirus came to support Folk Fabulous at the Fair, which is a 12-day folk festival that we sponsor at the South Carolina State Fair in the fall. And I just want to assure everyone that any donations, any gifts you all decide to make to the museum on the Midlands Giving Day, May 5th, will be used to support the artisans and the folk musicians, the traditional artists that we feature there, who have been, well, many of whom have been very affected by the coronavirus. The traditional musicians we've talked with, Folk Heritage Award winners, people who participate in the South Carolina Arts Commission's Traditional Artist Apprenticeship Program, their work has dried up because no concerts can happen, people can't come together. And so I just want to assure anyone who does have the capacity, the ability to give that day, that your funds, your money will go to support those traditional artists who have been really hard hit in many cases by the economic impact of the coronavirus. So on that dire note, although it's not a dire note, because I think, again, one of the things that museums can do in these times is to make sure that resources that we have access to do get to people who really need them. And so, that said, I look forward to seeing you all on, and invite your friends and family to tune in on Saturday, May 9th for the second online quilt documentation day sponsored by the McKissick Museum at the University of South Carolina. Stay safe, have a wonderful holiday weekend, and I'll look forward to talking with you then. Bye-bye. Oh, wait. Irene Miller, could you talk about storage of a 1930 quilt? Absolutely. Sorry about that. I just now saw that question on the side. Well, storing quilts, at home can be a challenge, but there are ways you can responsibly do that and take care of it. The two big enemies of quilts are light, so light sources, and humidity, so moisture. So you want to make sure that your quilt is stored in a place in your home where there's not direct light, sunlight especially, is damaging to quilts, and it's not moist. So, my basement, for example, I have a dehumidifier in my basement because it's so damp down there, and I do store some of my clothes down there. So I bought a dehumidifier in order to make sure that the humidity level there is not so bad that I get mildew on my clothing. So you want to choose a space in your house that does not get direct sunlight and is not humid. One of the easiest, safest ways to store a quilt, and I'm guessing in 1930s quilts, they tend not to be huge quilts, unlike earlier quilts or sometimes later quilts. 1930s quilts tend to have been made for a double bed or a twin size bed. And so you can fold them and put them in a pre-washed all cotton pillowcase and just be sure that you regularly refold them every several months, so that the places where they're folded don't get creased or don't have permanent creases. So that's a very minimalist way to safely store your 1930s quilt. You can be more ambitious. You can roll your quilt, because that, from a museum conservation perspective, is really the more preferred way, because if you roll your quilt, it won't have creases or the potential for having creases, which is where the fabric would be weakened. So you can go to a carpet store or any store that has a cardboard roll or some kind of even plastic tubing, and you wrap that tubing with pre-washed muslin fabric, cotton fabric, all cotton fabric, and then you can roll your quilt on that fabric or on that tube, and then wrap it again in a sheet of cotton, whether that's a cotton sheet, literally a cotton sheet from the store. You can use cotton sheets or cotton fabric that you have because you happen to be a quilter or otherwise have access to cotton fabric. So in that way, you protect the quilt from any leaching from any cardboard tube, and you prevent the creasing of the quilt over time from folding, and then you protect it on the outside, again, from dust and dirt coming onto the quilt. And depending on, again, what kind of house you live in, I know people store their rolled quilts under their beds because they keep those clean, and they will put them under their beds or in the back of a big, closet, and keep them safely that way stored. Does that answer your question, Ms. Miller? I understand that there's a 15-second lag time or so between when you hear what I say. So that's why I'm waiting to see if maybe Irene Miller. Okay. I have conflicting info on a red, white, and blue Indian wedding ring, lightweight bound edge quilt. How do you verify? Okay, this is coming from Irene Miller. And I guess, Irene, I need to understand what the conflicting information is on your red, white, and blue Indian wedding ring quilt. Can you please explain the nature of the conflicting information that you have received? I guess I'm wondering, is it conflicting information about the date of it? Welcome, Christian. I'm waiting for Irene Miller to clarify. She has conflicting information on a red, white, and blue Indian wedding ring quilt that's lightweight, has a bound edge. So I'm waiting to see if she might share with us what kind of conflicting information she's got, whether it's conflicting information about the date or the pattern name. Age of fabrics versus pattern age. Okay. Well, I'm hoping that you'll be able to share some images of that quilt with me. And maybe if I'm able to bring my technological savvy up to speed, I can share that with our viewers in May. Because I'd really have to see the fabrics, and I use I don't know what books you're using or resources to try to date the pattern, but I depend on Barbara Brackman pretty heavily for she's got an encyclopedia of piece patterns as well as applique patterns. So she has done just an enormous amount of research with regards to when these patterns enter the popular culture. And so that's who I would reference in terms of looking at what the pattern age is. And then I would need to see some image of the fabrics to have a sense of, whether the fabrics were perhaps older than the pattern entering into the popular discourse. Because sometimes, if you're a quilter at all, and I have been a quilter in some of my lives, I have fabrics, over that span 50 years. So, okay. So she's got a conflict. So she's getting mixed messages between what the family history is about this quilt versus the Kansas City published date. Okay, so so in this case, I mean, I'll just be honest with you. Family histories are wonderful to have because there is always a truth there. So it's what the family has transmitted through generations oftentimes, and it's a story that helps the family be a family. It's a story that threads through the narrative of the family's life. Sometimes, that doesn't match up with the historical record. And we can, again, do some more research using Barbara Brackman's Encyclopedia of Piece Patterns to see when that pattern, when we think that pattern, came into popular use, and then try to understand a little bit more this family story and how that might have evolved in response to, I don't know, moving, changes in, relationships over time, whether, it skipped a generation in terms of who was interested in the quilt and in the stories about the quilt. So yeah, it's not unusual to have conflicting information from a family history versus what we can tell from the scholarship about when a quilt pattern came into wide use or popular use. And it's not something to be really concerned about. Again, I tell people who find that they have this conflict in their family or between family history versus what we know, from the research that's been done about quilts now, is that there is always an element of truth in the family story. Let's see here. Irene Miller is saying it was a wedding gift in 1880. Photos and primary sources, including pictures, I would have to take out of storage. Okay. Have you done, I guess my question would be, have you done the genealogy to confirm that it was a wedding gift in the 1880s? Because it could have been a wedding gift that was later, but the story got changed over time. And it's worth taking, it's worth looking at the primary sources in that case to understand that. And if, there are instances in which a pattern will be used or a pattern like something that becomes more popular later on will appear simply because, quilt artists often, people who made quilts often were textile people in other realms, especially weaving, or they knew weavers. And there's a lot of exchange between weaving patterns and quilt patterns, I think, during certain historical moments that hasn't been thoroughly explored, I think, at this point in time. But yeah, I think it's worth, looking at the primary sources, take them out of storage and take a look at them. And we can have a conversation, like I said, about, what the research says, and then what the family history says, and see where the discrepancies are specifically. And then again, the fabrics will tell us something, at least in terms of the earliest that could have been made. But it's not unusual to have a quilt made in 1920 that includes fabrics from 1860, because people who sew keep scraps and fabrics for long periods of time. So what fabrics are in the quilt aren't always, I mean, they can help you with a time frame. I mean, the earliest it could have been made, but you can't quite pin down the latter part. But I really am intrigued. So I'm hoping that you will take the time to find those photos and primary sources. And between the two of us, we can make sure the genealogy research is done with the names and the information that you've got, so that we know that the dates are accurate for your family's history. And then again, when I see some images of this quilt, I'm hoping that, again, the fabrics will be some clue as to the dating, certainly the earliest date it could have been made. But then again, I will look back at Barbara Brackman's Encyclopedia of Piece Patterns to see when is the earliest that she has determined that particular pattern came into the popular culture. Does that work okay? I'm just waiting to see if Irene wants to weigh in a little bit more. I'm thinking out loud here, but it seems to me that if the quilt includes primarily red, white, and blue fabrics, the country would have just celebrated its centennial, 1876 centennial. So those kinds of fabrics, those colors of fabrics might have been popular at that time. So it'll be really fascinating to see, what the fabrics are in this particular quilt. And I look forward to that very much. So I hope you will go online, Irene Miller, and fill out the form and email it to me so that we can talk further about this. I'm very intrigued and interested. Thank you for participating today, for joining us. I think with that said, I will go ahead and close for the day. Again, thank you all for joining me, Jane Prysby, with the McKissick Museum at the University of South Carolina on our first live quilt documentation day this spring. See you May 9th. Bye-bye.